So we're here to talk through this Yajilin variation that uses castle wall loop counting. And one of the things that's key in castle wall counting is to actually mark edges you can't cross. So I'm just going to start with like this 0 to the right clue and say that that means for sure I'm not crossing any more edges in this row. So I'm going to mark off these boundaries. And in doing that, I get a constraint that's pretty typical in Yajilin puzzles. I don't want to see cells that have only one or one option left to get in or out from it. So a cell like this one here has to be shaded because a loop can't enter and exit that cell if we can't cross these boundaries. And so an early thing in this puzzle is to mark this part of this corner. We actually now have this cell right here that's got only one entry to it, so the loop comes around it. And we can keep marking things like this, but at least as a starting point to give this space. And there's another way right at the start you could mark this edge in because of the 2 to the left, and that will fulfill this clue. But really the next key set of deductions will come from thinking through more typical Yajilin rules, which have to do with these areas where we have two cells but a need to be bending through them. And in a two-cell space, like in this corner, if any one of these cells was shaded, the other cell is unshaded, but now needs to have the loop come in and out from it. And you can see that you really have just one entrance or exit. Similarly, in this space, you could come in from the top, but the loop would be stranded. And so when you have two cells together that are pinned in any part of the grid, those two cells must always be part of the loop. You can't shade one and not the other. And so these ends in the corners are also key. And straight away, you'll see that that means that this one down clue starts fulfilled and marks the number of these cells straight away as no longer being crossable from castle wall constraints. And there's another place which is a typical Yajilin rule, which is in these two cells. Let me sort of shade them another color. These two cells are also now a path that's going to be connecting different parts of the grid, and you can't shade one of them without the other being part of the loop. And because they would then form a single cell isolated point, both of them must be part of the loop. And so at the start of the grid, we could also have marked in this part of the loop edge, and once again, that's going to give us this castle wall constraint for this clue just below. So we've done a pretty good job of marking in these spaces and marking in these edges, and let's just see what that actually leads to when we think through the consequences. One of the things it does is we've marked off cells like this cell and this cell that have only one path into them. This is just like the first example over here, so the loop has some quick things it must do around those. It's got to come by these channels for sure. That leads to some of its own consequences. We now actually have another space where we've got these two cells that are going to be part of a channel, and if you shaded any one of them in, like let's say you shaded this in, you now have isolated the loop on the left side. So we again have a space where the loop's got to come through this long channel. So we're going to learn that we've got a shade here, and we've got a shade here, and the loop's going to extend like this. We're going to have to shade this cell. Let's see what's next. We just actually, in marking this loop path, completed that clue, and so let's mark these edges off in a castle wall sense. And now we're going to have a new kind of deduction, which is where we have a partial sum. We have one loop end that's already crossed a border, so we can't take two more. If we did this, we'd get up to 3. So that says that we have to, for castle wall constraints, mark this as unused, and that puts in this loop edge, which gives us a total count now of 2 for that column, and that finishes this. That puts in this boundary just to the top of the black square. The loop's got to come through here, the loop's got to come across here, this has to come here, and this corner turn. Got an isolated cell, get these edges coming through, and this looks like the key sticking point of the puzzle. Certainly a tricky spot, and lots of different things to try to think about here. One of the teases looks to be this 4 to the left clue. There are only 5 edges in total, 2 of them already taken. So one thing to do is, like, can you consider which of these edges isn't used and prove to yourself sort of where the cancellations happen. I think the thing that stands out a little more to me is this top part of the grid that has 3 loop ends, and it's going to need to get one more loop end or potentially 3 loop ends to the top. You have to have a parity matching. So let me describe what I mean. Let's say that we didn't have any more loop ends coming from the bottom. And this is obviously not legit, but let's say that we've effectively bounded off this edge. We have 3 ends up here, and however they connect, one of them gets stranded. So you'll always need to have at least one more edge coming to the top. And if you actually take 3 edges to the top, you get something like this, which is going to quickly force a set of constraints in the grid, which is this turning over here, this turning there. This fulfills the 4 to the left, but now look how the lower left of the loop is constrained and isolated. And so we've got a space where we need to put one more loop end to the top, and we're going to need to use at least one of these channels. And that seems to be a pretty key constraint, because if we're using at least one of these channels and we're not using all 3 to the top, this end must come down. And then whichever of these channels works is going to be a fine part for the Yajilin solve. So that way of getting the right number of ends to a part of the grid is how I'm thinking the best approach is. At least it works for me right now. This loop end has to bound around the black shaded cell, keeps bounding around the black shaded cell. These 2 loop ends are now about to close and must dodge. So this comes down, this comes across. These loop ends are now the same loop ends, and they're about to touch, so they've got to dodge. We've got 4 to fill in for this row, and there's only one way to do that now. This loop end is going to come through, and we're going to get an isolated cell, which needs this loop end to come across and complete. And so pretty fun puzzle. It had a whole lot of the same type of castle wall deduction, which is a set of Yajilin seeds that fulfilled clues to mark these X's pretty quickly, whether the one down or this one up through forced edges that were pretty obvious at the start, or eventually this kind of 2 up that had a channel that we couldn't go through as places to work in. That set up a key sticking point in the middle that we got through by using some loop end counting. There may be some other techniques there, but for sure that was the hardest point of the puzzle, was how to solve the center. So I hope you learned something about this variation. If you want to hear about Easter eggs for this puzzle and for the rest of the week, you can stay on. Otherwise, spoilers are about to come, so this would be a good time to stop the video, or at least think if you want to have too many secrets revealed. But we're about to go, and the thing to see for most of this week is that all the puzzles had pretty consistent language, but it's language we don't always use, which is like instead of their usual meaning and then a whole lot of text. And sometimes people will just by default go straight to the puzzle and not read through any of the instructions, and we'll see what happens if we do that here. So let's treat this as a Yajilin, and it's going to have some pretty quick break-in points. This 4 to the left, where it wasn't a quick break-in point before, is a quick break-in point now, because all those shaded cells are quickly forced. It actually gives us where these cells are all part of the loop. This still is a space where the loop has to quickly form some turns and come through. And so we've got to come through here. We're going to have to fill in 2 shaded cells to the left of this 2. And notice that they can't be these cells, because that would cause some issues. And it also strictly can't be the cell that's just off the corner for various reasons. So this is a way to start, and then we can come back and say which of these cells is shaded. And notice that if you shade this cell, you're going to make the loop have to go both of these directions, which looks very, very bad. So it's not that this cell here is shaded, it's this cell to the right is shaded. And that will do this. That's going to put in a corner cell, and this is isolated, but that now forces this to be part of the loop, so we'll mark that in. The loop's going to have to come down and around, come down and around. We're going to get a shaded cell here. The loop's going to come down and around. So that all looks credible. We have cells like this, which are all part of the loop. So to get 2 to the right in the space, these 2 cells, which are 1 away from each other, are going to be shaded. Pretty typical Yajilin step. We're going to have some cornering around blackened cells in the space. Get this coming across. 1 more shaded cell. These loop ends in this cell and this cell would come together too soon. This would short circuit the loop, so they would stay apart and connect in the other option they have for them. This loop end has to come down. We've got the fact that this 0 to the right is actually now a uniqueness constraint in this grid. To force one loop. But notice that while this solved quite well as that variation with some interesting steps behind it, it also solves fully reasonably as a Yajilin puzzle, actually much easier as a Yajilin than Yajilin Castle Wall. And this is a trait of all the puzzles in this week, but an example of the elegance JinHoo put into all of these constructions to have pretty good solves in both directions for all the puzzles through the week. So hope you enjoyed seeing how that worked out, and we'll see you again soon.